Authoritarianism is marked by submission to the authority of the state. It is a form of government characterized by strong central power and limited political freedoms. The political power is condensed into one authority figure. Generally, they are assume power and are accountable to a few people or no one. Generally speaking, the state could either be democratic or authoritarian. But is this enough? Or should we study authoritarian practices? If so, authoritarianism can occur within democratic states, by several states collaborating, or with the help of corporate actors. One of the most pervasive features of Middle Eastern politics is its supposed authoritarianism. Why are there so many authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and Central Asia? What impact has authoritarianism had on democracy and development? Could there ever be a transition to democracy in the Middle East or Central Asia? This interview with Dr. Mustafa Elmenshawy focuses on authoritarianism in the Middle East. He will highlight the causes and kinds of authoritarianism in the Middle East we have today. Dr. Mustafa Elmenshawy, postdoctoral researcher at Lancaster University. He holds a PhD in politics from University of Westminster and has an MA in Middle Eastern politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies. His main research interests concern the interplay between discourse and politics in the Middle East. His latest publication is Sovereignty Alignment Process, Strategies of Regime Survival in Egypt, Libya, Syria, published in the Third World Quarterly earlier this year. Some of his articles are uploaded to Blackboard.
Authoritarianism, the name implies, is about authority, and authority is controlled by political agents, which is mainly the state and its leader. And there are two different ways of controlling authority. First, typical traditional one is the use of force, coercion, or the domination or monopoly of power. The second one is the soft power, in which ideology comes as the key word. Think of religion, think of the media, think of the religious sermons, mosques, churches coming in the way is where authoritarianism takes shape, in the either use of force or the lack thereof. Well, it's a very broad question. It's a very good in the sense that it seeks to understand and reach a certain sort of causes or specific reasons why authoritarianism endures in the Middle East. I'll try to fragment and divide the answer across different lines. The first line is geography. It could be, you think of, there's Montesquieu, one of the most famous scholars, who argues that where you are determines what kind of democracy or the lack of democracy you are. For example, his argument, because the UK is an island, it's surrounded by water is everywhere. That means it's more democratic than countries which has border lines, simply because borders, as land borders, means that all the time you need an authoritarian leader who is in control of the army, who the army is always in war with different enemies, outside enemies, and this is where the legitimacy of authoritarian leadership is based on the fact that there is a war that is being conducted by the leader. So this is geography. The second one is history. So a lot of the arguments are a bit historically deterministic in the sense that the Middle East evolved the way it is because the colonization as a one age after the end of or the beginning of the independence and end of the Western colonialism in the 20th century, the colonizers left behind a number of leaders to take over, and those leaders are elected, but they gain their power, as you mentioned, or you put in the readings, Eva Balin, external support. So the leaders, as authoritarian as they are, gain their legitimacy from this external element that evolved across history. And of course, this is why you end up with authoritarian leaders as a dynasties, like think of Assad. Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000, and before him, his father. Think of the Jordanian case. Think of all different cases as well that come along where history keeps trickling down in the shape of a leader after a leader, and of course they inherit this authoritarian legacy as well. The third element, some arguments speak about ideology, like religion. There's a massive debate if the specific religious interpretations of Islam is leading to an authoritarian entities in the Arab region. Religion is different from the interpretations of it. So when it comes to, for example, the proclamations made by the Saudi king, for example, his title is not only the king of Saudi Arabia, he has another lovely title, which is the custodian of the holy places. And the Moroccan king as well, his title is not only a king, he is also the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or the Emir, or the king of the believers. So this is where religion and politics conflates and intersects in a way that you can disentangle them. Why this is authoritarian? Because simply, if you and me raise our hands and say we are not happy with what the leader is doing, the first thing that the leaders would do, hang on for a second, I have the religion on my side. And this is where all the opposition dissent is being suppressed, falsified, and hidden as well in the name of a specific religious interpretation that come along with it. So it sounds a bit complicated, it is, but the only way is actually to think of specific elements or causes of that. Rentier state, which is simply a lovely, but it's a simple, but it's a great, insightful, and thought-provoking theory. And the argument is as simple as such, because the money comes from the ground, which is the oil, energy. That means actually the distribution of resources in the hands of the leader. That means it's about taxes, or if you think of the Western example, the most famous slogan is no taxation, no representation. The money is not coming from taxes, the money is coming from the ground. So what happens is citizens cannot claim democracy because simply the leader is completely have this kind of clientelist network and patronage, which is separate from citizenship. And this is where the citizen has no rights because he has no duties as well. Meaning of the Gulf regions, citizens never pay taxes. So it's a tax-free countries. So that means actually when there are no taxes, that means no obligation on the leader to democratize because he's not owning a bit of his legitimacy to citizens, he's owning a bit of this legitimacy to, if you put it, to the ground, to oil. This is why they call it oil states or oil authoritarianism, which is a bit different in a way from non-oil states coming along. So I agree with you that energy plays a very important role on correlation here, because if you are an authoritarian leader, that means, number one, all decisions coming from above. So there's a bit of centralism in decision making. So that means you're the leader, you are taking decisions, and everyone below you has to obey. So this kind of obedience coming along means that the development is always the time centralized in the hand of the leader. Why this is problematic? Because the leader can, in this case, can have his own network, collaboration, or actually a bit of patronage networks, and in the sense that the clientelist system would allow only a few people who are closer to the leader to access these development resources. And if you notice in Syria, you have a specific family, Makhlouf family, which is closer to Bashar al-Assad. In Tunisia, you have the Trabulsi family. So it's a very family-based sort of development. Why this is important for democracy, or the lack of democracy, is individuals are not the point of departure. They are not the center of attention, but the leader and people around the leader are important on that. The second important element of development is the sense of accountability. In most authoritarian states in the Arab region, you cannot ask simple questions like where your money comes from, how you spend it, how did you obtain this money? Because simply the conflation between the leader and people around him and development projects are very problematic. I conducted a bit of research about the authoritarianism in the Arab region, and one key element of former politicians or activists is that in order to access the leadership, as authoritarian as it is, you need to have someone in the family in order to carry any kind of development plans. So all the time the leader asks for a share of any development projects, and this is where authoritarianism is substantiated, is taking root in the in the region as such, in a way that you cannot change it. I think that we have to be very cautious when it comes to the word religion, because exactly you cannot have Islam is a religion, but there are different interpretations, different versions of religion. So when we speak about religion, we are not speaking about the textualized sacred religion. We're speaking about the interpretations, if you like, the distortions, manipulations of the religion itself. So I am a Muslim, but doesn't mean necessarily I'm an authoritarian. But a leader will be claiming his specific interpretation of Islam, and in that case it would stand as the authoritarian version using the religion as such. The main problem when it comes to the use of religion, it's one of the main elements in the durability of authoritarianism in the Gulf region, for example, is you mentioned the word leadership. Every leader in these parts of, specifically Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, or Qatar, everyone is searching to be the leader of the region in one way or another. And this is where religion comes very important. And sadly, we have to go back and think of the feud, the historic blood feud between the Sunnis and Shiites, which is the most classic example where religion is being evoked, restored literally 1,000 years back in order to say, hang on for a second, just we are actually much better than the Iranians because we are Sunni Islam, and the Iranians would argue that this is not the true because we have the Shia Islam. So you end up with religion part of the authoritarian durability because it's used, it's weaponized in this kind of regional geopolitical struggle. And you cannot literally separate it, especially when leaders are all the time securitized, use it as a speech act. All these kind of expressions. The Jordanian king in one occasion, he argued that we have to be careful, or a Shia crescent coming to the Middle East. So the leaders themselves are constructing, are shaping the discourse of authoritarianism in these religious overtones, referring to the Sunnis and Shiites. So religion is a weapon used by leadership in this sense, and it's effective as well because simply you cannot contest or deal with these kind of religious proclamations made by the leaders. It's very strange and perhaps contradictory about authoritarianism because authoritarianism is about stability, durability, nothing changed. But at the same time, leaders who stay for 30, 40 years in power all the time need to upgrade their authoritarian tactics.
Right.
So this is why you end up with these literature and scholarship, which is argue new authoritarianism or liberal autocracy or liberal authoritarianism, different shades, different shapes as well. Authoritarianism. So authoritarianism is very dynamic. The authoritarian toolbox is always changing. So this leads me to the second question, which is actually, I call it the first ladies of authoritarianism. My main argument is that the wives of the leaders play a very critical role in the authoritarian stability, if you like. What I argue is that we shouldn't think of the wife of the president as only a woman in the gendered traditional roles, but as a political actor as well. For example, Mubarak, after ruling literally 30 years, he became very frail, sick, and he cannot take a decision. So who jumps and takes over his wife and his son? So this sense of dynamism that comes with authoritarianism allowed the first lady to take a role in that. So the first lady is part of the soft power. And at the same time, you put one article in the reading list of Eva Balin, and one of her arguments is that authoritarianism stays on in the Arab region because of external support. And this is where the role of the first lady comes along. If you and me or any of your students watching us right now may research about Queen Rania or the Asma al-Assad or Susan Mubarak, all you come across common them, they are very just completely westernized. They look very modern in one way or another. Queen Rania, you can find her, or the Asma al-Assad, you can find her in all these kind of fashion magazines, for the lavish style. They're coming from a very middle background. Susan Mubarak's mom was Welsh. Just Asma al-Assad was born and raised here. She went to a very prestigious educational system as well. So there is a sense of selling the authoritarian identity as to the West in the sense of the First Lady. She is the friendly face of authoritarianism, which is completely different from their husbands, mostly military men, mostly just their education is not up to the standard of the first wives. So you see this sense of the complementation between the first lady or the wife and the husband slash the leader that comes along. So my argument is that there is a gap because everyone thinks of authoritarianism structurally, like the army, the police, the ruling elites, but no one is start thinking, hang on for a second, it's not only about that, it's about soft powers as well, roles and visibility of the first lady that come along. And it's a bit strange in a way because many scholars think of the first lady as owned by the president. She is devoid of her agency, the capacity to act, the manifestation of that capacity. My argument is that the first lady has a sort of agency as well, but it's really striking. My argument proves true in the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring, because what happened is that protesters in the street were not only mentioning the names of the presidents or the leaders as their targets of the wrath and just the anger, but they mentioned the first ladies as well, because they think of the authoritarianism as a joint account, if you like. Everyone is putting money on it, but everyone is benefiting from it for their own purposes. And this is why I'm interested in the authoritarian bit of it. That my argument is that part of the authoritarian durability depends on an identity of getting people together as a sort of collective, in which actually this collective identification is not only about religion, it's about nationalism, secularism, whatever ism that you think of, as long as people come together and then they can be controlled in the name of group identity. So, and why authoritarian? Because simply it's not about the individual. It's only about what is collective. This is why I'm tracing the speeches of a number of Arab leaders. And one of the most interesting elements in my discourse analysis is that they all the time ask their people, the citizens, to sacrifice their personal interest for the sake of the collective interest, regardless of what collective is. They call it homeland. You need to sacrifice for this. It's all these kind of expressions that come along. This is why it's as a key strategy of survival and legitimation is bringing in this kind of collective identification, as you mentioned, in the name of secularism, in the name of nationalism. And it's strikingly important here. You see, it's not about religion, because chap like Assad, for example, is actually bringing in secularism in order to argue that, in order to avoid the religious fundamentalism that is buffeting Syria right now, what we need to do is actually to have a secular identity. So he is actually establishing his authoritarianism by secularism, which is the anti-religious element in it. So it's not about religion or secularism. It's about how, as you mentioned, how they bring in the authoritarian toolbox that you have, they open it and say, okay, let's bring the religion now and let's bring secularism. This is why Assad faces this kind of accusation. He's not as religious as the rest of the Sunni majority because he's Alawite. And some arguments in the Sunni interpretation of Islam consider Alawite Shia as non-Muslim. So he's coming with an expression he calls it al-almaniya mu'mina, which is the faithful or believing secularism, or the believer's secularism in a way. So secularism, which is religious in order to complete this kind of contradictory picture. So it's about the manipulation of religion as a social political fact and how you use it. So which is interesting. And if any student is interested in this part of literature about the uses, as symbolic as it is, of religion in politics, you can read Peter Berger. He wrote The Sacred Canopy. It's a very small book, but very interesting. I'm sure you are aware of it. So it's a great book. So which I recommend massively on this topic.
Dr. Elmenshawy covered vast areas of authoritarianism in the Middle East, the history of colonialism and its legacy, the role of religion and culture, energy and its implications, and the significant role the First Ladies play to uphold authoritarianism. Dr. Elmenshawy used the term authoritarian toolbox to demonstrate how regimes in the Middle East employ different strategies, old and modern, to manage their power. Finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Elmenshawy to give his time to deliver this interview. I also want to thank our students to help me to formulate the questions and to support me with the video editing.